Reformation pretty much unfolded according to geographic lines and boundaries, so that you have in Germany and the Scandinavian countries some sort of Lutheranism, and coming out of that, all the Lutheran denominations. In Switzerland and other northern European countries, you have what's called the Reformed churches. And then in England and Scotland, you have the Church of England and Presbyterianism. Now, for chapters 45 through 58, we really need the background of the Reformation in England and Scotland to sort of get an idea of what all these documents are about. In fact, you almost can't understand some of these articles. For instance, the Book of Common Prayer, or the King James Bible, or the story of John Bunyan, without an understanding of how the Reformation occurred in England. So to do that, I want to talk about 3 books, 2 of which I have selections in our textbook. The first is what's called the Book of Common Prayer. I think that's chapter 58. To understand the Book of Common Prayer is to understand Episcopal Church or Anglicanism or the Church of England. In 1521, King Henry VIII wrote his treatise defending the 7 sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church. So he steps into the theological arena defending Catholicism and defending the Pope against Luther and Calvin and the Reformation. His wife, Catherine, he had married through a special dispensation by the Pope, because it was his, if I understand it correctly, his brother's widow, and he needed the Pope's permission to sort of break the laws and get and to marry her. Well, she had various miscarriages and stillbirths, and was not able to give him an heir to the throne. So several years later, he fell in love with and became infatuated with one of the women in the court, Anne Boleyn. He needed a divorce, which he had to get from the Pope in order to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope said no. The Pope had given him permission to marry her. He was not going to give permission to divorce her. Well, all of a sudden, King Henry VIII decides that the Reformation teachers were onto something. And so they take over the monasteries, they take over the churches. And in England, the form of the Reformation is what I think it was McGrath in another book that he has written that I read, called The Middle Way. England sort of took a middle way in the Reformation. Now, I want you to imagine yourself there at the time of the Reformation and realizing that the church was corrupt, and discovering the Scriptures and wanting to return to the pure faith of the Scriptures. There were different approaches to how this would look. For instance, in Scotland, in the Presbyterian church that would develop in the Church of Scotland, they had a principle called the regulative principle, and in that they said only what the Scripture teaches should be done. Whatever church traditions, whatever practices, liturgy, how to do church, we're only going to do it in the way that the Scripture prescribes it to be done. This is the regulative principle. And that's not stated that way by Calvin and Luther, but there's some degree to which that is applied to them as well. But in England, the approach was sort of the opposite. in the Reformation, and that was, we're going to remove anything that is anti-Scripture, but we will maintain anything, the practices, the liturgy, the prayers, the structure of church and worship. We're going to maintain anything that is clearly not anti-biblical. Okay, so the first thing, and it's very significant, that the King James Bible was translated in 1611, but the first edition of the Book of Common Prayer was 1549. Okay, 60 years prior to the translation of the Scriptures into English, an authorized translation. The Church of England took the Latin prayers, the Latin Mass, the Latin order of service, the Latin confession of sins, and they took those services and they translated them into English. That is the Book of Common Prayer. It went through many revisions. The first one, like I said, done in 1549. The primary editor of the first edition and several successive editions was a reformer named Thomas Cranmer, and a lot of the shape of the Book of Common Prayer really goes to his credit. There are various selections from the Book of Common Prayer in our textbook. One of them, perhaps the most famous, being this, and you may have very likely did not know where this came from. This is page 474 of our textbook. See if this sounds familiar. Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony, which is an honorable state instituted of God in the time of man's innocency. Sound familiar? About the only thing you have to say is dearly beloved, and you'll know how to fill in the blank. Most folks know that. Well, why are those words so meaningful to us? Because in 1549, the Church of England, in their way of doing the Reformation, was to take the liturgy and the prayers that had accumulated over 1,500 years in the church, translate them into English. Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and this was to be the structure of church. Daily prayers, the scripture readings, a schedule of scripture readings, how to have a wedding service, how to have a funeral service, how to have to anoint, ordain a bishop or a priest. That is the Book of Common Prayer, okay? And it's sort of the cornerstone of the worship, the liturgy of the Church of England's worship services. Now, when we say Church of England, folks in England will call it C of E. We say Church of England, we also mean Episcopalianism or Anglicanism. Although there are different structures if you go to different countries, they're not all technically the Church of England, so that in America it's the Episcopalian Church USA, but whereas in the case of the name Church of England, you're referring to the specific one in England. Episcopalianism refers to the hierarchical structure of the church. Now, there's a lot that could be said about that, but we'll just leave that there, I think. It's interesting to me. Now, the next book I want to mention is a translation of the Scriptures that was done in 1560, called the Geneva Bible. Geneva, you should know as the city of Calvin. And do you remember I described Calvinism as that that instrument that took the Reformation internationally, the vehicle for taking the Reformation and making it international versus the real provincial nature of German Lutheranism. Well, in Scotland, when the Reformers, the chief one of which was a man named John Knox, were fleeing persecution from Scotland, Knox and others fled to what city? Geneva. And in Geneva there was a thriving English-speaking congregation, and they, in 1560, published their own translation in English of the whole Bible, including notes. Their belief about how the church should be structured was different than in England. So whereas in England, the King Henry VIII separated from Rome, he made himself the head of the church. The king is the head of the church, and under him the Archbishop of Canterbury would be the chief spiritual leader of the church. Well, these Scottish Presbyterians, in their study notes to the Geneva Bible and to their, even in the way that they did the translation, emphasized not the central authority of the king over the church or the episcopal structure of bishops. They emphasized instead elders and a board of elders or an assembly of elders, and that Presbyterian form of church government. You can imagine that in England, this Geneva Bible was not much appreciated by the king. You'll have to read about John Knox. He's a very interesting figure, and there's some great stories about him. The next book that we want to talk about then, I wanted to mention, was the King James. You've already hopefully read the preface, the complete preface to the King James Bible, and you'll get a spirit of what they were expecting when they made that translation. Did you notice that they were really anticipating a lot of resistance in their publication of it? They tell the story in the preface very briefly about how the Puritans, when James I was made King of England, met him and wanted to present their demands to him about how they thought the church ought to be structured, and they make a variety of demands. One of them is that the church be structured and ordered according to Presbyterianism instead of Episcopalianism. They wanted freedom and editorial changes to the Book of Common Prayer. They wanted more freedom in the way that they did religious services instead of the Book of Common Prayer. And then they wanted a better translation of the Scriptures. In that preface, he talks a little bit about that. James turns down all of their demands, but says that perhaps it is wise. Their demand, even though it was perhaps ungodly, their desire for a better translation of Scriptures is good. James had been the monarch in Scotland. They were expecting, when he assumed the monarchy and became King of England, that they had found themselves an ally. James, however, knew that no monarchy or no Episcopalian, no bishop, no king. That was a slogan that he knew. If they do away with bishops and the bishopric and Episcopalian government, they don't need king. In this Presbyterianism that they were trying out in Scotland meant a sort of form of representative democracy, and that was the nature of the structure in the church. They wanted to see that in the church in England, and the king realized that this was at the very foundation attacking the claim of the king and the rights of the king to be king. He was right about that, and the next 100 years would show just how right he would have been about that, and that was that in the later 1600s, these Presbyterian factions would in fact kill Charles, behead the king, and then the Parliament would take over and set up what's called the period of the Commonwealth in England. Well, I began using the term Puritan without entirely explaining it. So, there developed in England, or there came about in England, pastors, theologians, teachers who believed that Henry's version of the Reformation was not enough. I mentioned the phrase middle way. He believed we were taking a middle way. There's Scripture, and there is tradition, and we'll take a middle way, some middle way between Scripture and tradition. We'll keep all those traditions they might not be mandated in Scripture, but that they're okay, and we'll keep them. They call it the via media, the middle way. Well, there were many Puritans that thought that was no true Reformation. There are many pastors. They called these Puritans. Now, they certainly had a common ethical ideal and morality, but the phrase Puritan, which was used in a derogatory fashion, really, though, was about them wanting to purify and take a further reform in the church. That's what it was about. They didn't like this Catholic-like Protestantism that had developed in England. So, for instance, we're going to read about John Bunyan later, who would be imprisoned for 12 years. He writes Pilgrim's Progress. He writes a spiritual biography, Grace Abounding, to the chief of sinners in those 12 years. Bunyan just wanted to preach the Bible, and he refused to be ordained to subject himself to the ordination in Church of England. He didn't agree with that. Further, he was not going to do church services in the form and fashion that they wanted him to do them in. He wanted to stand up and preach the Bible as he saw fit to preach the Bible. And this is why these Puritans, who were standing against the form of the Reformation that was there in England, would come to be persecuted, in fact. So that's a little bit of the background. Some of the richest literature in the past 2,000 years of Christian history was written in England by these individuals who wanted to the Church of England return to more biblical roots. They're called Puritans. J.I. Packer refers to the Puritans as the California redwoods of Christianity. They were very educated. Many of them were very educated and understood Greek and Latin and Hebrew. And the Scriptures, they were practical in nature in the way that they taught the Scriptures, as well as deeply theological. Their books are theological and yet devotional in nature as well. And there is a variety even of theological perspectives among them. Some of them believed in congregationalism, a more democratic rule. Others in Presbyterianism. You have some that are like those Presbyterians that believed in infant baptism, and you've got ones like John Bunyan who believed in believer's baptism. So I want to commend all those authors to you, and look out for names like John Bunyan and John Owen and Stephen Charnock And God bless you. I hope that those notes will give you a little more insight and understanding these chapters 45 through 58, which were written during that period.